2,000 years ago, at the very peak of the ancient world, humanity constructed an economic and military machine of absolutely unprecedented power. They called it Rome. This was not just a city, it was the ancient world's first true, fully functioning global economy. Endless rivers of unimaginable wealth flowed constantly from the furthest corners of the earth directly into the beating heart of the imperial capital. The absolute lifeblood of this massive, unstoppable machine was unwavering trust, complete and utter trust in the pure, uncorrupted silver of the Roman denarius, the ultimate currency that drove global trade. This magnificent economic miracle was quite literally paved with solid stone. Tens of thousands of miles of perfectly engineered roads connected a sprawling, massive market of millions of people. Standing firmly behind this era of unprecedented prosperity was the terrifying and invincible might of the Roman military legion. They were the ultimate enforcers of global trade, security, and the legendary Roman peace. But such unimaginable greatness always comes with a quiet, devastating price. As the empire's borders stretched further into the unforgiving wilderness, the sheer financial cost of border defense began to violently skyrocket. To maintain this colossal machine, the imperial state demanded an endless, exhaustive supply of fuel. A massive, bloated, and heavily corrupt bureaucracy slowly began draining the life and wealth out of the hard-working middle class. Hidden beneath the glittering marble surface, the entire economic foundation relied heavily on a brutal system of cheap, disposable labor. The moment the empire stopped expanding and conquering, the fundamental mathematics of their economy completely collapsed. Desperate to prevent massive, violent riots in the streets, the panicked government began providing free grain and endless entertainment to the struggling masses. The world's first massive, entirely unsustainable welfare state was suddenly born. If you look closely at the map of the empire during this time, it was no longer a picture of triumphant strength, but a terrifying portrait of fatal, irreversible overextension. Yet the ruling elites noticed absolutely nothing of the incoming disaster. Completely isolated in their decadent luxury villas, they foolishly believed that the immense wealth of the past would somehow guarantee the stability of the future. Meanwhile, down in the crowded, dirty markets, a silent, creeping terror finally took hold of the ordinary people. Everyday prices began to rise, slowly at first, and then violently out of control. Suddenly, pure silver could no longer buy the basic bread a family needed to survive. Hidden away in the dark, secretive corners of the imperial mint, the desperate state committed the ultimate financial treason. They secretly began replacing the pure, valuable silver in their coins with cheap, worthless lead and copper. The arrogant politicians genuinely thought they could simply print their way out of a catastrophic structural collapse. Instead, their reckless actions personally invited the storm that would destroy them. The glorious golden age of antiquity was completely over. The long, incredibly dark winter of the Roman economy had finally begun. The glorious illusion of the Pax Romana was violently shattered by the agonizing reality of actually maintaining it. Deep in the freezing, endless mud of the dark northern frontiers, exhausted Roman legionaries marched toward their doom in grueling, never-ending military campaigns. The sheer, overwhelming financial cost of garrisoning these massive, icy stone fortresses along the treacherous edges of the known world began to completely bleed the imperial treasury dry. As the borders expanded far beyond the absolute limits of human logistics, the complex, fragile supply chains that fed the massive empire finally began to ruthlessly break down in the dirt and despair. Desperate to hold back the terrifying tides of enemies, the weakened state was forced into a humiliating and deadly compromise, reluctantly outsourcing their sacred defense to brutal, heavily armed barbarian mercenaries who demanded their payment strictly in pure silver. And then an apocalyptic shadow suddenly fell over the crowded, unsanitary Roman cities in the form of the devastating Antonine Plague, a horrifying demographic shock that mercilessly wiped out millions of innocent taxpayers and essential laborers almost overnight. Across the desolate, tragedy-stricken Italian countryside, once thriving agricultural engines completely collapsed, leaving vast, overgrown wheat farms entirely abandoned as overtaxed, hopeless farmers simply surrendered to starvation and despair. Ruthless, heavily armed government tax collectors descended upon the terrified population, brutally confiscating the last remaining tools, livestock, and dignity, effectively destroying the very middle class that had originally built the empire. Out on the treacherous, unguarded seas, maritime security completely evaporated as vital global trade routes were aggressively severed by violent pirate fleets that set wealthy Roman merchant ships ablaze in the dead of night. The magnificent classical infrastructure of Rome, once the absolute envy of the entire ancient world, was slowly and deliberately left to decay and crumble, with massive marble aqueducts violently cracking and spilling precious, life-giving water into the neglected dust. A sickening, insurmountable wealth gap forcefully divided the entire population as the ultra-rich patricians selfishly barricaded themselves inside heavily fortified luxury estates, while starving, desperate commoners begged endlessly in the dark shadows of their high stone walls. Deep inside the darkest, most secure underground vaults of the imperial treasury, a horrific, paralyzing truth finally dawned upon the terrified emperors as they stared at an absolutely empty, echoing room. The richest, most powerful empire in human history was fundamentally, undeniably, and catastrophically bankrupt. Up in the grand marble halls of the Senate, fat, corrupt, and utterly useless politicians aggressively fought each other for the pathetic scraps of remaining power, completely gridlocked and entirely blind to the burning, collapsing world outside their doors. Out in the distant, brutal military camps, the furious, unpaid legions finally turned their violent wrath against the very state they had sworn to protect, bashing their heavy iron swords against their shields in terrifying, deafening mutinies. The immense, unbearable weight of this administrative nightmare forcefully began to tear the unified empire in half, as deep, violent cracks permanently split the fractured administration between the dying West and the surviving East. And as the dark, cold rain fell upon the trembling hands of a desperate, broken citizen, the final, fatal economic blow was quietly revealed, a thin, worn-out layer of fake silver washing away to expose the cheap, worthless copper beneath, signaling the terrifying dawn of catastrophic hyperinflation. Deep within the choking smoke of secret imperial mints, the desperate Roman state committed the ultimate financial treason. Blacksmiths secretly melted down pure silver denarii, maliciously mixing in massive amounts of cheap lead and copper. To the untrained eye, the newly minted coins still looked shiny, but a single scratch instantly revealed the dark, pathetic bronze rotting underneath. Out in the chaotic marketplaces, the absolute nightmare of hyperinflation rapidly took hold. Terrified bakers frantically crossed out daily prices on wooden boards, writing massively higher numbers in charcoal just to survive. In the dimly lit rooms of once prosperous homes, devastated middle-class citizens sat in crushing despair, staring blankly at chests overflowing with tens of thousands of low-quality bronze coins that were now entirely worthless. Out on the bleeding frontiers, heavily armed Roman legionaries furiously rejected their pathetic salaries, throwing bags of fake currency back at their commanders and demanding pure gold or physical grain. Desperate to regain control, the tyrannical government hammered massive bronze plaques onto city walls, brutally attempting to enforce absolute maximum prices under the strict threat of death. But the laws of economics cannot be dictated by failing emperors, and immediately tense black markets exploded in the pitch-black alleyways. Desperate patricians quietly traded priceless marble statues directly for a single sack of raw wheat from sketchy smugglers. The vibrant streets of classical Roman shops were eerily abandoned, their heavy wooden shutters permanently nailed closed as merchants gave up on a monetary system too corrupted to function. Society aggressively devolved backwards into primitive barter, where a trembling hand would tragically exchange a pure gold family ring just to secure a simple loaf of stale bread. Meanwhile, deep underground in secret fortified stone vaults, the untouchable Roman elites selfishly hoarded towering stacks of pure gold ingots, protecting their real wealth from the hyperinflation destroying the surface world. Unstoppable, terrifying riots violently exploded across the starving streets of Rome over the skyrocketing price of basic food, forcing armored praetorian guards to form massive shield walls against the furious plebeians. Ironically, the deeply hypocritical state completely lost faith in its own fraudulent money. Ruthless tax collectors forcefully seized real physical assets like cows and iron tools from broken peasant families who had nothing else left. In the filthy, rain-soaked streets, massive mountains of millions of debased Roman bronze coins were carelessly dumped and abandoned, treated like absolute garbage and representing the ultimate death of a failed fiat currency. On the ancient bronze scales of history, a single tiny piece of dry bread now carried far more fundamental weight and true value than an entire overflowing mountain of cheap, worthless imperial coins. And as the internal economic engine of the greatest empire in human history permanently died, a chilling new shadow emerged through the freezing fog of the northern forests, signaling that the hungry wolves had finally arrived. The total collapse of the Roman economy immediately triggered the rapid physical disintegration of the empire itself. On the bleak, freezing borders, unpaid and starving Roman legionaries simply dropped their heavy shields in the mud, deserting their posts and walking away into the mist. Instead of defending the crumbling frontiers, heavily armored Roman armies violently turned on each other, fighting bloody, pointless civil wars over the remaining scraps of political power. Across the fading empire, magnificent marble aqueducts shattered and ran completely dry, overgrown by thick weeds as the profound knowledge of advanced ancient engineering simply died. The grand Roman Forum, once the shining, undisputed center of the global economy, descended into a tragic state of miserable urban decay, filled with broken statues and desperate homeless citizens. Without the mighty legions to hold the line, an endless, terrifying horde of Germanic barbarian tribes freely crossed the frozen, unguarded rivers directly into the vulnerable Roman heartland. The redistribution of wealth was now executed entirely by brutal force, as ruthless warriors smashed beautiful marble busts and violently looted heavy chests of gold from the terrified, once arrogant elite. In a deeply humiliating scene of diplomatic surrender, a weak, desperate Roman emperor officially handed over vast, lucrative territories to an intimidating barbarian king just to buy temporary, fragile protection. Fleeing the starving, overtaxed and increasingly dangerous capital, terrified wealthy and middle-class citizens frantically packed their remaining belongings into wooden carts, escaping blindly into the lawless countryside. This desperate mass exodus triggered the dark, oppressive birth of feudalism, as starving city dwellers kneeled in the dirt before heavily armed warlords, willingly trading their freedom for basic food and physical safety. The once bustling, magnificent global port of Ostia Antica was completely and eerily abandoned, with huge Roman merchant ships rotting and sinking into the shallow, muddy water as international maritime trade ceased to exist. In the spreading, uncontrollable chaos, precious papyrus scrolls containing centuries of complex law, advanced mathematics, and irreplaceable economic records were tragically scattered in the mud and burned in small, dying fires. Inside the grand, echoing halls of the Roman Senate, a few remaining completely powerless old men sat in the dark shadows, arguing pointlessly while the magnificent empire completely disintegrated just outside their heavy doors. In the burning, apocalyptic ruins of a fallen city, a small, battered group of the last true Roman soldiers formed a hopeless, desperate shield wall, completely surrounded by an overwhelming ocean of roaring barbarian warriors.
The absolute, undeniable symbol of the empire's brutal death was finally realized as a fierce warlord violently grabbed a fallen golden eagle standard from the bloody mud, raising it triumphantly into the dark, stormy sky. And as the terrifying dust settled over the ancient ruins, the broken marble face of a fallen emperor slowly began to morph into the cold, unforgiving steel and glass of a modern skyscraper, bridging the tragedy of the ancient past directly into our present day.
2,000 years have passed, yet the terrifying ghosts of the Roman collapse loudly echo through the concrete canyons of our modern metropolises. The breathtaking, hyper-modern glass and steel skyscrapers of our financial centers stand as monumental achievements, blinding us with the exact same illusion of eternal prosperity. Inside the highly secured walls of modern central banks, aggressive printing presses endlessly churn out billions in fiat currency, directly mirroring the desperate Roman blacksmiths secretly poisoning their silver. On the chaotic, panicked floors of global stock exchanges, sweating traders desperately scream at digital screens glowing ominously in bright red as the fragile illusion of infinite economic growth violently shatters. Hanging heavily above our darkened city streets, giant digital clocks track a crushing, mathematically impossible national debt that spins wildly out of control, representing the unbearable weight of a modern empire. Down in the incredibly expensive aisles of modern supermarkets, exhausted, hard-working citizens stare in absolute shock at simple grocery receipts, realizing their rapidly devaluing money can no longer buy basic survival. Up in the luxurious halls of modern parliaments, wealthy politicians aggressively argue and point fingers, completely ignoring the massive, devastating economic storm rapidly gathering right outside their reinforced windows. A sickening, stark contrast of modern inequality forcefully divides society, as out-of-touch billionaires drink champagne in ultra-luxurious penthouses, while struggling citizens are forced into dirty tent cities on the streets below. The absolute illusion of modern purchasing power is finally melting away, just like a plastic credit card transforming into a worthless ancient coin, revealing the terrifying truth about our debt-based financial system. Out on the crumbling, decaying concrete highway overpasses, exposed rusting iron tragically mirrors the broken, abandoned marble aqueducts of antiquity, neglected by a state consumed by its own massive deaths. Violent, uncontrollable riots are aggressively exploding across neon-lit city streets as furious citizens clash brutally with heavily armored modern riot police, forming a terrifying visual echo of the desperate Roman bread riots. Spread far too thin across the entire globe, hundreds of incredibly expensive modern military bases drain the absolute last remaining financial lifeblood from an unsustainable, rapidly declining superpower. Staring into the dark, reflective glass of a high-rise window, a powerful modern president might tragically see the weary reflection of a doomed Roman emperor staring right back, powerless to stop the cycle. In the grand, unforgiving hourglass of human history, sound money is constantly transformed into cheap, worthless paper by the relentless alchemy of modern inflation and systemic government greed. Massive, terrifying, and dark storm clouds are rapidly gathering over our modern megacities, bringing the exact same apocalyptic collapse that once buried the Roman Forum. The cycle of history is absolutely ruthless, and as the cold wind slowly blows a thick layer of dust over the forgotten face of a modern state eagle, the ultimate warning of Rome is finally complete.